according to a story that has been sold in hotel conference rooms, on photocopied pamphlets, and now on TikTok for more than 40 years. The debt you carry is not actually yours to pay. The mortgage, the car loan, the credit card balance, the student loans. All of it, the story says, can be discharged, wiped clean, zeroed out, because hidden inside the United States Treasury, there is a secret account that was opened in your name on the day you were born. In some versions of the story, the account holds $630,000. In others, it holds $1 million or several million, growing quietly since the moment a clerk stamped your birth certificate. And the trick, believers say, is simply knowing how to access it. A particular stamp, a particular phrase, a particular filing sent to a particular office, and the debt dissolves. The people who believe this are not a handful of cranks. The FBI Bond has estimated that hundreds of thousands of Americans hold some version of this belief, and federal courtrooms from Florida to Alaska have spent decades processing the paperwork it generates. Which raises a question that almost nobody who encounters this story ever asks. Not whether it works. It does not work, and we will show you exactly why, in the government's own words. The better question is where an idea this specific could possibly have come from, because a myth this elaborate, with its own vocabulary, its own documents, its own rituals of punctuation and capital letters, does not appear out of nowhere. It has an author. It has a birthplace, it has a date, and when you trace it back, you arrive at a failing wheat farm on the northern plains in the middle of the 1980s, at a man whose name almost none of his modern followers have ever heard, and at a real event, a genuine rupture in the history of American money that happened on June 5, 1933, which the myth has been feeding on ever since. That real event is the part of this story that should actually unsettle you. We will get to it. Here is the path this episode is going to walk. First, the man who invented the modern version of this trick, a North Dakota farmer named Roger Elvick, and the specific financial catastrophe of the early 1980s that made his invention land. Second, the actual text of House Joint Resolution 192, the 1933 Act of Congress that believers cite as the source of the secret account, and what it really did to the American dollar. Third, the anatomy of the paperwork itself, the all-capital letters name, the phrase accepted for value, the UCC filings decoded piece by piece. Fourth, the federal law Congress passed in 1996, written almost specifically because of this scheme, that turns the magic paperwork into a felony carrying up to 25 years. And fifth, the strange kernel of truth buried at the center of the myth, the real thing that happened to American money in 1933 that the whole legend is a distorted memory of. Every one of those 5 stops has a document behind it. None of this is speculation. This channel traces the paper trail of American money and power, working from congressional records, federal court filings, and the archives of the agencies involved. Everything you're about to hear about the origin of this scheme comes from those records, and where the record relies on a specific organization's research, we will name it as we go. Start on the plains. In the early 1980s, American farm country went through a collapse that people who lived through it compare, without exaggeration, to the Great Depression. Through the 1970s, farmers had been urged, by their bankers and by officials in Washington, to borrow heavily, buy land, buy equipment, plant fensero to fensero. That phrase, fensero to fensero, was the actual slogan of Earl Butz, Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, who told farmers to get big or get out, because the Soviet grain deals of 1972 had opened export markets that seemed bottomless and land values only went up. And for a while, the math worked. Total American farm debt roughly tripled between 1970 and the early 80s, climbing past $200 billion, and as long as land appreciated, the debt was collateralized. Then Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve, fighting inflation that had touched 14%, drove the federal funds rate past 18%, and the prime rate briefly touched 21.5% in 1981. Jimmy Carter's grain embargo against the Soviet Union after the invasion of Afghanistan cut the export markets farmers had leveraged themselves to serve. Grain prices fell. Land values in parts of the Midwest dropped by roughly half between 1981 and 1985, with Iowa farmland losing more than 60% of its value peak to trough. A farmer who owed $400,000 against land that had been worth $600,000 suddenly owed $400,000 against land worth $300,000, and the same banker who had urged the loans now arrived with foreclosure papers. Tens of thousands of family farms went under, and rural banks failed alongside them. More than 60 in 1985 alone, the worst year for bank failures since the Depression. Farm suicides rose sharply enough that states opened crisis hotlines, and by 1985 the crisis was so visible that Willie Nelson and John Mellencamp staged the first Farm Aid concert to raise money for families losing their land. And into that landscape of grief and betrayal came men with an explanation. Groups like the Posse Comitatus, a far-right movement built around the ideas of a retired California man named William Potter Gale, traveled the foreclosure belt, telling ruined farmers that the debt was never real in the first place, that the banks had lent them nothing of substance, only numbers in a ledger, that the entire monetary system had been fraudulent since 1933. Gale's movement held that the county sheriff was the highest legitimate authority in the land, and that the federal government, the Federal Reserve, and the income tax were instruments of an illegitimate occupying power, and the movement had already produced real bloodshed. In 1983, a North Dakota posse adherent and tax protester named Gordon Carl killed 2 federal marshals near Medina, North Dakota, went on the run, and died months later in a shootout in Arkansas that also killed a county sheriff, an event that made him a martyr in exactly the circles where the debt theology was incubating. For a man watching a sheriff's auction of his grandfather's land, the underlying message did not sound like extremism. It sounded like the first honest thing anyone had said to him in years. Roger Elvick was one of the men in those rooms. A farmer from North Dakota who had lost his own operation, Elvick became, according to research by the Southern Poverty Law Center, a promoter for Gale's network and its offshoot, the Committee of the States, and somewhere in the mid-1980s he moved from repeating the ideology to engineering something new out of it, a product. He began teaching farmers to pay their debts with documents he called cite drafts, official-looking instruments drawn against the United States Treasury on the theory that the Treasury secretly held the real wealth backing every citizen. The drafts were worthless. The farmers who tendered them to banks and to the IRS made their situations catastrophically worse, because tendering a fake instrument to a federal agency is not a clever argument. It is evidence. And in 1991, per federal court records, Elvick was convicted on federal charges connected to the scheme and sent to prison. That should have been the end of the story. It was the beginning, because what Elvick did next is the reason a farm crisis hustle from the Reagan years is now circulating on your teenager's phone. To understand what he built, you first have to understand the true event the whole legend is anchored to, because the anchor is real. In March of 1933, the American banking system was in full collapse. Roughly 9,000 banks had failed since 1930. Depositors were pulling gold out of vaults faster than the system could bear, and the new president, Franklin Roosevelt, closed every bank in the country by proclamation within 36 hours of taking office. In April, Executive Order 6102 required Americans to turn their gold coin and gold certificates in to the Federal Reserve at the then official price of $20.67 an ounce, under threat of a $10,000 fine and up to 10 years in prison. And on June 5, 1933, Congress passed House Joint Resolution 192, which declared that clauses in contracts requiring payment in gold were against public policy, and that all debts, public and private, could be discharged dollar for dollar in legal tender currency. Read that language again, because the myth lives inside it. Congress used the word discharged. It said obligations may be discharged upon payment in legal tender. What the resolution actually did was mundane and enormous at the same time. Millions of American contracts, mortgages, bonds, leases, an estimated $100 billion worth of obligations in a national economy of roughly $60 billion contained gold clauses, promises that debts would be repaid in gold coin of a fixed weight. Those clauses were themselves a folk memory of an earlier trauma, inserted by creditors after the Civil War greenback era to protect themselves against paper money. If they had been enforced after Roosevelt devalued the dollar, repricing gold from $20.67 to $35 an ounce, debtors would have owed roughly 69% more overnight, and the economy would have been annihilated. So Congress voided the clauses and said paper legal tender settles any debt. That is all. Money owed still had to be paid. It simply had to be paid in Federal Reserve notes rather than gold. The Supreme Court upheld the arrangement in the Gold Clause cases in February 1935 in a cluster of 5-4 decisions, Norman against Baltimore and Ohio Railroad chief among them, that were among the most closely watched of the era. Roosevelt was so worried about losing that he had privately drafted a speech announcing he would refuse to comply with an adverse ruling, and Justice James McReynolds, dissenting from the bench, reportedly departed from his written text to say that the Constitution, as many of us have understood it, is gone, and, in the account that made the newspapers, this is Nero at his worst. But notice what had genuinely changed. Before 1933, an American could, at least in principle, take a dollar to a bank and demand a defined weight of gold. Afterward, the dollar was backed by nothing but the legal requirement that everyone accept it. Money had become, openly and by statute, a creature of government declaration. That is a true fact. It is a strange fact, and it is exactly the kind of fact that folk memory does not store accurately. It stores it as a wound. Something was taken in 1933, and 50 years later, on the foreclosure-ravaged plains, Elvick and the men around him gave the wound a story. If the government took the gold, the story went, then the government must have given something in exchange. It must have pledged the citizens themselves, their labor, their future earnings, as the new collateral for the currency. And if the citizens are the collateral, then somewhere there must be an account recording what each citizen is worth. The birth certificate in this telling is not a record of a birth. It is a security, a bond, registered and traded, and believers will point to the certificate's printing on banknote-style paper and to the file numbers along its edge as proof, when the paper is simply anti-counterfeiting stock and the numbers are ordinary vital records indexing. The all-capital letters version of your name printed on it is not typography, the theory says. It is a separate legal entity, a corporate shell, a strawman, created by the government to borrow against your value. Your flesh and blood self and your capital letters self are two different parties, and the debts belong to the paper one. Elvick called the process of separating them and seizing the hidden value redemption, a word chosen with care because it carries both the financial sense of redeeming a bond and the religious sense of saving a soul. And the scheme has always sold both at once. Every word of that mechanism is invented. The Treasury has stated flatly, in published fraud alerts from its Bureau of the Fiscal Service, that no such accounts exist, that birth certificates are not securities, and that cite drafts drawn on the Treasury are worthless. The Federal Reserve has published the same. Courts have said it hundreds of times, in language that ranges from patient to openly exhausted. And in 2012, a Canadian judge, Associate Chief Justice John Rook of Alberta, wrote a single 700-plus paragraph decision, Meads against Meads, cataloging the entire family of what he called organized pseudo-legal commercial arguments, precisely so that no judge would ever have to rebut them from scratch again. But look at what the invention accomplishes psychologically. It takes the genuine strangeness of fiat money, the true fact that dollars are backed by decree rather than metal, and converts it into a personal treasure map. Not the system is strange, but the system owes you, specifically, $630,000, and here is the form to get it. Now watch the idea move through 3 lives, because the demographics of who falls for it are the real story of why it survives. Picture first a man we will call Harold, a composite of the scheme's first generation, drawn from the pattern in the court records of the era. Harold is 58 in 1986, farming 1,200 acres in western Minnesota that his family has held since the 1920s. He owes the farm credit system roughly $500,000, and the land under him has lost 40% of its value in 4 years. At a meeting in a Grange Hall, he pays $300 for a packet of documents and instruction in the cite draft remedy, and he tenders a draft for the full balance of his loan. The bank returns it as worthless. Harold, following the instructions, files papers declaring the bank in default and liens against the loan officers personally, because that escalation is built into the packet. The remedy never fails in the seminar's telling. It is only ever obstructed, and every obstruction demands another filing. 18 months later, the farm is gone anyway, sold at auction, and Harold is under federal indictment for the liens, having converted a financial tragedy into a criminal record. Multiply Harold by several thousand, and you have the scheme's first harvest. Now move forward and picture the second generation gathered on a foreclosed ranch outside Jordan, Montana in 1996, because this chapter is not a composite at all. A group calling itself the Montana Freemen, led in its financial theology by a former crop duster named Leroy Schweitzer, had declared the property a sovereign enclave they named Justice Township and industrialized Elvick-style paper, running week-long seminars that taught visitors from around the country to write bogus liens and so-called controller warrants against public officials, and to draw checks against those fake liens in the millions of dollars. Prosecutors would eventually put the face value of the fraudulent paper the freemen generated in the tens of millions, and some of their fake instruments were polished enough that recipients briefly honored them, one man reportedly receiving a genuine refund check from the IRS after overpaying a tax bill with a Freeman warrant. When federal agents finally moved in, arresting Schweitzer at the property's edge in March 1996, the remaining freemen held out through an 81-day armed standoff, the longest in modern FBI history, an operation the Bureau ran with deliberate restraint because the disasters at Ruby Ridge and Waco were only a few years behind it. Schweitzer ultimately drew a sentence of 22.5 years in federal prison and died in custody at Florence, Colorado in 2011. The Fake Money seminar had become a national security event. And then picture the third generation, a woman we will call Danielle, a composite of the cases prosecutors describe today. Danielle is 34, a home health aide in suburban Atlanta in 2021. Carrying about $60,000 in student debt and $9,000 on credit cards. The pitch reaches her not in a Grange Hall but in a slickly edited video, and the man selling it does not look like a militiaman. He looks like a life coach, and the vocabulary has been laundered accordingly. The straw man is now your secret trust. Redemption is now becoming private. The racial politics of the posse era have been sanded off so thoroughly that the scheme now flourishes in black communities under the banner of the Moorish sovereign movement, a historical irony given the movement's white supremacist roots. For $2,500 she receives her redemption package, files a UC financing statement claiming ownership of her own capital letters name, and mails the IRS a return claiming a massive refund drawn against her secret Treasury account, a maneuver the IRS has listed for years in its annual Dirty Dozen roster of tax scams. What she gets back is a $5,000 frivolous filing penalty under Section 6702 of the tax code, assessed per return, a flagged file, and, because she followed the coaching and did it twice, a referral for criminal investigation. Same trick. Same paperwork, nearly word for word. 60 years of technological change, and the only thing that evolved was the sales funnel. And here is the detail that binds all three generations together, the one Elvick's modern customers never learn. Elvick himself, after serving his federal sentence in the 90s, was charged again in Ohio in 2003 over the same paperwork, was initially found mentally incompetent to stand trial, and, per Ohio court records, eventually pleaded guilty and went back to prison. The inventor of the debt discharge trick could not discharge his own legal debts with it twice. So let us take the machine apart, piece by piece, so that if this paperwork ever crosses your desk, or your parents' desk, or your brother-in-law's Facebook feed, you recognize every component on cite. Component 1 is the secret account itself, and the citation believers author for it, House Joint Resolution 192. You now know what that resolution actually says. It voided gold clauses and made legal tenders sufficient payment for debts. It created no accounts, pledged no citizens, and monetized no birth certificates, and the full text is 2 paragraphs long and freely readable in the Congressional Record of June 5, 1933. When someone cites it as the source of your hidden money, they are counting on you never reading 2 paragraphs. And there is a coda the sellers never mention. Congress quietly repealed the operative language of the resolution in 1977, and gold clauses have actually been enforceable in new contracts ever since, which means the supposed legal foundation of the secret account has not even been on the books for most of the scheme's existence. Component 2 is the capital letters strawman. The reason your name appears in all capitals on government and financial documents is that mainframe systems going back to punch cards and early optical character recognition standardized on uppercase because it was cheaper and more reliable to process, and the conventions simply persisted. That is the entire mystery. No court in American history has ever recognized a legal distinction between Joel Smith in capitals and John Smith in mixed case, and judges have dismissed the argument in published opinions using words like frivolous, fantastic, and, in one memorable federal opinion, gibberish, with the Seventh Circuit's Judge Frank Easterbrook among the most quotable on the general genre, noting of similar sovereign arguments that they have no conceivable validity in American law. Component 3 is the magic phrase accepted for value, usually stamped in red diagonally across a bill or a court notice, along with its cousin the cite draft and the fake instruments called bonded promissory notes. The stamp is meant to invoke a real doctrine, acceptance under the law of negotiable instruments, the way a bank accepts a draft. But a debtor cannot accept his own bill into payment any more than a diner can stamp a restaurant check paid and walk out. This is where the scheme stops being sad and becomes dangerous, because in 1996, in the direct aftermath of the Montana Freeman and the flood of fake instruments coming out of these movements, Congress added Section 514 to Title 18 of the United States Code, the fictitious obligation statute. It makes producing or passing a fake financial instrument that purports to be issued under the authority of the United States a federal felony, punishable by up to 25 years. Read that carefully. The redemption paperwork is not merely ineffective. Congress wrote a specific felony around it, and prosecutors use it regularly. Ask Winston Shrout, one of the most prolific redemption gurus of the internet era, who taught seminars on international promissory notes for years and was convicted in federal court in Oregon in 2017 on 13 counts of issuing fictitious instruments, having created fake paper with a claimed face value in the trillions. Or ask Heather Ann Tucci-Jaraff, a former licensed attorney whose Treasury account theories helped a follower briefly transfer millions out of a strawman account scheme in 2017, and who drew a federal sentence for conspiracy. Component 4 is the UCC filing, the part of the ritual that feels most official to believers, because it is the one piece that a government office will actually accept. Here is why. A UCC financing statement is just a public notice that one party claims a security interest in another party's property, the mechanism a bank uses to record its interest in a business's inventory, and state filing offices are required by Article 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code to accept them ministerially without reviewing whether the claim is true. The clerk stamps it because the clerk stamps everything. Believers experience that stamp as government validation, and gurus photograph it as proof the remedy works. It proves nothing, and the movement's habit of weaponizing such filings, recording bogus multi-million-dollar liens against judges, sheriffs, and prosecutors, a tactic investigators call paper terrorism, has real teeth. Because a lien, even a fraudulent one, poisons a title search and can freeze a victim's ability to sell a home or borrow until a court expunges it. The response has been legislative. The majority of states have passed expedited procedures for voiding fraudulent liens and, in many states, felony charges for filing them, and the FBI has formally classified sovereign citizen extremists as a domestic terrorism concern since a 2010 bulletin, in part because traffic stops involving adherents have turned deadly, most infamously in West Memphis, Arkansas in May 2010, when a father and son steeped in sovereign ideology killed 2 police officers during a stop. Component 5 is the funnel itself, and this is the tell that requires no legal knowledge at all. In every generation of this scheme, from the $300 Grange Hall packet to the $2,500 streaming course, the money flows in exactly one direction, from the desperate person toward the teacher, and it flows in ordinary, non-magical United States dollars. The man who tells you money is an illusion will not accept his fee in side drafts. He wants Venmo. If someone in your life is in real debt trouble, the unglamorous truth is that actual remedies exist. Bankruptcy law, negotiated settlements, non-profit credit counseling, and a licensed attorney can walk through them, because nothing in this video is legal or financial advice. What we can tell you as a matter of documented record is that the Treasury account remedy has a 40-year unbroken 100% failure rate, except for the men selling it, and even they keep going to prison. And yet, having dismantled every component, honesty requires admitting the strange thing at the bottom of the wreckage, the reason this myth outlives every debunking. The believers are wrong about the account, wrong about the straw man, wrong about the stamp, and yet they are circling, clumsily, a true and genuinely unsettling fact, which is that modern money really is created by declaration and bookkeeping. When a bank issues you a loan, it does not hand over a depositor's gold, and it does not even hand over other depositors' dollars in the way the textbook multiplier story implies. It creates the deposit as an entry on its own ledger in the act of lending, a fact the Bank of England spelled out plainly in a 2014 quarterly bulletin titled Money Creation in the Modern Economy, written by staff economists Michael McLeay, Amar Radia, and Ryland Thomas, which stated outright that the majority of money in the modern economy is created by commercial banks making loans, and which startled even some economists who had taught the older story for decades. The dollar really did stop being redeemable for anything in 1933 domestically and in August of 1971 internationally, when Richard Nixon closed the gold window on a single Camp David weekend and severed the last thread between the dollar and metal, a weekend this channel has covered before. The redemption movement is what happens when people glimpse that genuine strangeness without the history attached, and a con man is standing nearby to sell them a story with their own name in it. The real history is stranger than the myth, and harder, because in the real history there is no secret account with your name on it. There is only the collective enforceable agreement that the numbers mean what we all act like they mean. The myth offers a key to a vault. The truth is that the vault is empty and always has been, and the money works anyway. That is a far more interesting mystery, and it belongs to everyone, not just to those who bought the seminar. So hold the whole ark in your hands one last time. A 2-paragraph act of Congress in 1933 written to stop the Depression from swallowing every debtor in America. A shattered farm economy 50 years later, and a convicted North Dakota promoter who turned the wound into a product. A Montana standoff, a felony statute with a 25-year ceiling, a $5,000 penalty waiting in the tax code, and a sales funnel that has now reached the phone in your pocket, still promising the same $630,000 that has never once been paid out to anyone. The next time you see a video promising that a stamp and a filing can erase your debts through the Treasury, you will know the name Roger Elvick. You will know what House Joint Resolution 192 actually says, and you will know that the only people ever redeemed by redemption theory were the ones collecting the fees. If this kind of paper trail is why you are here, subscribe to the channel and tap the like button so the next investigation reaches you, and if someone you know has been circling one of these seminars, this might be the episode to send them before the paperwork gets filed. I will see you in the next one.